The rain came down hard against the tall windows of the Cross mansion, and Julian Cross stood frozen at the edge of his kitchen, staring at something that did not make sense. Outside, under the thin cover of a small awning, his housekeeper, Marta Reyes, sat on an overturned bucket, a plastic container balanced on her knees, eating alone in the storm. Julian blinked, thinking his eyes were playing tricks on him. He had a dining table with 12 chairs. He had a warm kitchen with a heater running. He had told every member of his staff, more than once, that they were free to eat inside whenever they wished. Yet there she was, soaked to the shoulders, shivering, taking small bites of rice as raindrops slid down her face. He set his coffee cup down so fast that it rattled against the marble counter. Without grabbing a coat, he walked to the back door and pushed it open. Cold wind rushed into the kitchen, carrying the smell of wet earth and something else, something like fear. "Marta," he called out, his voice sharper than he meant it to be. "What are you doing out here?" Marta jumped, nearly dropping her container. She wiped her mouth quickly with the back of her hand and stood up, bowing her head the way she always did when she felt she had done something wrong. "Mr. Cross, I am sorry. I did not think you would be home this early. That is not what I asked." He stepped closer, ignoring the rain that now soaked through his shirt. "Why are you eating outside, in this weather?" She hesitated. He watched her eyes dart toward the house, then toward the gate at the far end of the property, then back to him. It was only a second, but he caught it, the way a man who spent his life reading contracts and hidden clauses always caught the smallest inconsistency. "I like the fresh air," she said, forcing a small smile. "It clears my head." Julian did not believe her, not for a moment. He had known Marta Reyes for almost 3 years. She was quiet, hard-working, always the first to arrive, and the last to leave. She never asked for anything extra, never complained, never gave him a single reason to worry about her. But now, standing in the rain with her lunch turning cold and wet in her hands, something about her felt like a stranger. "Come inside," he said, softer this time. "You'll catch a cold." "I am almost finished," she said quickly. "Please, go back inside, sir. You will be late for your next meeting." It was a strange thing to say, almost as if she wanted him gone more than she wanted shelter from the storm. Julian felt an unfamiliar tug in his chest, something between concern and confusion. He was a man who built his fortune by noticing details other people missed: undervalued properties, hidden risks, opportunities buried under layers of noise. And right now, every instinct in him was telling him that something was very wrong with the woman standing in front of him. "Marta," he said, "I am not going anywhere until you come inside." She looked at him for a long moment, rain dripping from her lashes, and for the first time since he had known her, he saw something raw in her expression, something that looked almost like panic. Then, just as quickly, she composed herself, the way someone does when they have practiced hiding their feelings for a very long time. "All right," she whispered, and followed him inside. The kitchen felt impossibly warm after the cold of the yard. Julian handed her a towel from the drawer near the sink, watching as she dried her arms and face, careful not to look at him directly. He noticed her hands were shaking, though he could not tell if it was from the cold or from something else entirely. "Sit," he said, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. "Eat properly. There's no need to hide outside like you've done something wrong." "I was not hiding," she said, but her voice cracked slightly on the last word, and they both seemed to hear it. Julian sat across from her, resting his elbows on the table, studying her the way he studied a business proposal that did not add up. He thought about the last few weeks, trying to remember if there had been other signs he had missed. He recalled her leaving early on a Tuesday without much explanation. He recalled a phone ringing in her apron pocket that she silenced immediately, her face going pale. He recalled the faint shadows under her eyes that had grown darker each week, shadows he had noticed but never once asked about. He realized, with a small and uncomfortable jolt, that he had been living beside this woman's daily struggles for years, without truly seeing her at all. "Marta," he said carefully, "is everything all right at home?" Her spoon paused halfway to her mouth. For a second, she did not answer. The only sound in the kitchen was the rain drumming steadily against the windows and the low hum of the refrigerator. "Everything is fine, sir," she finally said. "Thank you for asking." But her eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of someone carrying a weight too heavy to speak about, someone who had learned that silence was safer than the truth. Julian had seen that look before, in boardrooms, in negotiations, in people who were one wrong word away from losing everything. He had never expected to see it on the face of the woman who dusted his shelves and folded his shirts every single day. He did not push her further, not yet. He simply nodded, letting the moment pass, though inside his mind was already racing with questions he could not ignore. Something was happening in Marta Reyes's life, something serious enough to make a proud, hard-working woman eat alone in a storm, rather than risk being seen, rather than risk anyone asking too many questions. As she finished her meal in silence and rose to return to her work, Julian remained seated at the table, staring out at the rain that had not yet stopped falling. He thought about how many times he had walked past her in the hallway, nodding politely, never once wondering what her life looked like beyond the walls of his home. That night, long after Marta had gone home, and the house had grown quiet, Julian sat alone in his study, a glass of untouched water on the desk beside him. He kept replaying the image of her outside in the rain, the fear in her eyes when he had called her name, the way she had tried so hard to seem fine. He did not know it yet, but that single rainy afternoon was about to unravel a secret that would change both of their lives forever. A secret Marta had been carrying alone for far too long, and one that Julian, despite all his wealth and success, had never once imagined existing so close to him. For the first time in years, Julian Cross found himself unable to sleep, not because of numbers or deals or deadlines, but because of a woman eating quietly in the rain, and the quiet, aching feeling that he needed to find out why. Over the next few days, Julian began paying closer attention to Marta in a way he never had before. He told himself it was simple curiosity, the same instinct that had made him successful in business. But deep down he knew it was something more personal than that. He watched her move through the house each morning, dusting the same shelves, arranging the same cushions, performing every task with the same quiet efficiency she always had. On the surface, nothing seemed different. But Julian was no longer satisfied with surfaces. On Wednesday, he noticed she skipped breakfast entirely, brewing a small cup of tea and nothing else, even though the kitchen was always stocked with more food than any one household could need. On Thursday, her phone rang twice during the afternoon, and both times she stepped into the hallway, her voice dropping to a near whisper before she hurried back to her work, with her expression carefully smoothed over. On Friday, she flinched so violently when a delivery truck backfired outside the gate that she dropped a stack of folded towels, her hands trembling as she bent to pick them up. Julian said nothing in the moment, but he filed each detail away, the same way he filed away red flags in failing companies, before deciding whether to walk away or dig deeper. With Marta, walking away had never even crossed his mind. He wanted to dig deeper, though he was not entirely sure why he cared so much about a woman he had spoken to so rarely over the past 3 years, beyond simple greetings and instructions. By the weekend, he decided he could not simply observe from a distance any longer. He found her in the laundry room, folding sheets with quick, practiced movements, her shoulders tense even in a task as ordinary as this one. "Marta," he said gently, standing in the doorway so he would not startle her, "do you have a moment?" She looked up, surprise flickering across her face. "Of course, sir. Is something wrong with the laundry?" "No, nothing like that." He stepped further into the room, choosing his words carefully. "I wanted to check on you. You seem tired lately. More tired than usual." "I am fine," she said quickly, the same answer she had given days earlier in the rain. "Just a little tired from work. Nothing to worry about." "You've been skipping meals," Julian continued, watching her closely. "You flinch at loud noises. You take calls in the hallway and lower your voice like you don't want anyone to hear. I am not trying to intrude, Marta, but I would be lying if I said I hadn't noticed." For a moment, she simply stared at him, and Julian saw something shift behind her eyes, a flicker of exhaustion so deep it seemed to reach all the way down to her bones. Then, almost as quickly as it appeared, she blinked it away and forced a small, tight smile. "You are very observant, sir," she said, her voice carefully even, "but truly, there is nothing you need to worry about. I appreciate your concern." Julian felt frustration rise in his chest, not at her, but at the wall she kept building between them every time he tried to get close to the truth. He was used to people telling him things, whether out of respect for his position or fear of losing something if they did not. Marta was different. She guarded her privacy the way a soldier guards a wound, terrified that if anyone saw it, everything else would fall apart too. "All right," he said finally, deciding not to push her further that day. "But my door is open if you ever need anything. Anything at all." She nodded, thanked him quietly, and returned to folding the sheets, though Julian noticed her hands were shaking slightly as she worked. He left the laundry room with more questions than answers, and a growing sense that whatever Marta was hiding, it was far heavier than simple exhaustion from long hours. That evening, Julian found himself in the garage, standing beside his car, as his driver, Daniel Ortiz, checked the tires before locking up for the night. Daniel had worked for Julian for nearly 6 years and often knew more about the daily rhythms of the household staff than Julian himself did, simply because he spent so much time waiting around, overhearing conversations, noticing patterns that a busy employer might miss. "Daniel," Julian said, trying to sound casual, "have you noticed anything different about Marta lately? She seems troubled." Daniel paused, wiping his hands on a cloth before answering carefully. "I have noticed she leaves earlier than she used to, sir. And sometimes she asks if I can drop her a few streets away from her actual house. She says it is closer to a bus stop, but I have driven past that street before. There is no bus stop there." Julian frowned, absorbing this new piece of information. "Do you know why she would lie about something so small?" "I do not know for certain, sir," Daniel said, choosing his words with obvious caution, the way an employee does when discussing another employee's private business. "But once, a few weeks ago, I saw her speaking with a man near the gate. She looked upset. He seemed to be asking her for money, though I could not hear the full conversation. She gave him something from her purse and he left quickly." Julian's stomach tightened. "Did you recognize the man?" "No, sir. I had never seen him before. He did not look dangerous, just insistent, like someone she owed something to, or someone connected to a debt." The word debt landed heavily in Julian's mind. He thanked Daniel for his honesty, and asked him to keep the conversation between them for now, not wanting to embarrass Marta, or make her feel spied upon, even though that was, in a sense, exactly what he was doing. He told himself it came from a place of genuine concern rather than simple curiosity, though he could not entirely separate the two feelings from each other anymore. Over the following days, Julian noticed more small inconsistencies. Marta's usual punctuality began slipping, arriving a few minutes late on 2 separate mornings, always apologizing profusely, always blaming traffic or a delayed bus, though Daniel had mentioned there was no bus stop near where she asked to be dropped off. She began wearing long sleeves even as the weather grew warmer, and once, when reaching for a high shelf, her sleeve slipped slightly, revealing a bruise along her forearm that she quickly covered again, pretending nothing had happened. Julian said nothing about the bruise directly, worried that confronting her too aggressively would only make her retreat further into silence. Instead, he began speaking with his assistant, Grace Bennett, a sharp and discreet woman who had helped him manage countless sensitive situations over the years, from delicate business negotiations to personal matters he preferred to keep quiet. "I need you to look into something for me," he told her one afternoon in his study, quietly and with complete discretion. "Of course," Grace said, taking a seat across from his desk, notebook ready. "What is it regarding?" "Marta Reyes," Julian said. "My housekeeper. I believe she may be in some kind of trouble, financial or otherwise, and I want to understand the full situation before I decide how to help." Grace nodded, jotting the name down without asking unnecessary questions, one of the many reasons Julian trusted her so completely. "I'll see what I can find. Public records, anything that might explain her circumstances. It may take a few days." "Take whatever time you need," Julian said, "but please, be careful. I do not want her to feel exposed or humiliated. She has clearly been trying very hard to keep this private." As Grace left the study, Julian leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, a strange heaviness settling over him. He thought about how easily he moved through his own life, surrounded by comfort, insulated from the kind of desperation that made a person eat alone in the rain rather than risk being seen struggling. He thought about the bruise on Marta's arm, the man at the gate, the money she had handed over so quickly, and the fear that flickered behind her eyes every time he asked a question that came too close to the truth. For the first time in a long while, Julian Cross felt genuinely afraid, not for himself, but for someone else entirely. He did not yet know the full story, but every instinct told him that whatever Marta was hiding, it was far more serious than tiredness or a difficult week. It was something that had been building for a long time, quietly, painfully, hidden beneath the surface of a woman who showed up to work every single day, with her head held high, no matter what storm she was walking through at home. That night, as rain once again tapped softly against his windows, Julian found himself thinking not about business, not about numbers or deals, but about the courage it must take for someone to carry such a heavy burden completely alone, and the quiet, growing certainty that he was not going to let her carry it alone for much longer. 4 days later, Grace Bennett returned to Julian's study with a thin folder in her hands and an expression far more serious than usual. She closed the door behind her before sitting down, a habit she reserved only for matters she considered truly sensitive. "I found some things," she said, sliding the folder across the desk. "I want you to know I was careful. Nothing here came from anywhere improper, just public hospital billing records, a few conversations with people in her neighborhood who were willing to talk, and some information Daniel shared after I asked him a few more questions." Julian opened the folder slowly, his chest tightening with each page he turned. The first document was a hospital admission record for a child named Leo Reyes, age 9, diagnosed several months earlier with a serious heart condition, requiring ongoing treatment and, eventually, surgery that the family could not afford through the public healthcare system alone. The costs listed on the page were staggering, especially for someone earning a housekeeper's wages. "Leo is her son," Grace explained quietly, watching Julian's face as he absorbed the information. "According to a neighbor I spoke with, Marta has been taking him to the hospital several times a week for treatment, sometimes very early in the morning before her shift here, sometimes late at night after she leaves. She has also been working a second job on weekends, cleaning offices downtown, just to keep up with the payments." Julian stared at the photograph clipped to the corner of the hospital file. A small boy with dark curls and a shy smile, looking impossibly young to be facing something so serious. He thought about Marta eating alone in the rain, saving her lunch, skipping meals, and the picture became painfully clear. She was not simply struggling. She was fighting for her son's life, quietly, exhaustively, without asking anyone for help. "And the man Daniel saw at the gate?" Julian asked, his voice lower than before. Grace hesitated before answering. "That is the more troubling part. According to what I found, Marta borrowed money from a private lender a few months ago, someone outside of any proper bank, to cover an emergency payment for Leo's treatment. The interest on that loan is extremely high, and from what the neighbor described, the man collecting payments has become increasingly aggressive when she falls behind. I believe that is the man your driver saw her giving money to. She has likely been paying him whatever she can, even when it means going without herself." Julian closed the folder, his hands trembling slightly, an unfamiliar feeling for a man who prided himself on remaining calm under any kind of pressure. He thought of the bruise on Marta's arm, the flinching at loud noises, the hushed phone calls, and a cold anger began to build inside him, directed not at Marta, but at the circumstances that had forced a devoted mother into such an impossible position. "Thank you, Grace," he said finally. "Please keep this completely confidential. I need to think about how to approach this properly." Grace nodded and left quietly, leaving Julian alone with the folder and the weight of everything he now understood. He sat in silence for a long time, staring at the photograph of Leo Reyes, a boy he had never met, whose life was hanging in the balance while his mother worked tirelessly in the very house Julian called home. The next morning, Julian arrived earlier than usual, hoping to catch Marta before the rest of the household staff arrived. He found her in the kitchen, preparing breakfast trays with her usual quiet focus, unaware that everything had changed overnight in his understanding of her life. "Marta," he said softly, "can we talk? Somewhere private." She looked up, immediately alert, sensing something different in his tone. "Of course, sir. Is everything all right? Please, sit down," he said, gesturing to the kitchen table. She hesitated, then obeyed, folding her hands in her lap the way she often did when she felt uncertain or exposed. Julian sat across from her, unsure exactly how to begin, though he knew there was no gentle way to reveal that he had learned her deepest secret without her permission. He decided honesty was the only fair approach, even if it risked her anger. "I know about Leo," he said quietly. "I know about his heart condition, the hospital visits, the second job, and the loan you took out to help pay for his treatment." Marta's face went pale, then flushed with something between shock and humiliation. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "How do you know these things? Who told you? Did Daniel—" "Please, sit down," Julian said gently, though firmly. "No one betrayed you. I asked Grace to look into your situation because I was worried about you, and because I care about what happens to the people who work in this house. I am not upset with you, Marta. I am upset that you felt you had to carry all of this completely alone." Tears welled in Marta's eyes, and for the first time since Julian had known her, the wall she had built so carefully around herself began to crumble. She sank back into the chair, covering her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking as months of exhaustion and fear finally broke free. "I did not want anyone to know," she whispered between shaky breaths. "I did not want pity. I did not want to lose this job because you thought I could not handle my responsibilities here, while also caring for my son. I needed this income, Mr. Cross. I needed it more than anything." "You would never lose your job because your son is sick," Julian said firmly. "Marta, look at me. You have worked in this house for 3 years, without a single complaint, without a single mistake, all while carrying a burden most people could not imagine surviving. That is not weakness. That is strength I have rarely seen in anyone, including myself." She wiped her eyes, still trembling, though something in her posture had softened slightly, as though speaking the truth out loud, even under these circumstances, had lifted a fraction of the weight she had been carrying for so long. "The loan," Julian continued carefully, "the man who comes to collect payments. Is he threatening you?" Marta's hands tightened in her lap. "He is patient as long as I pay something each week, even if it is small, but the interest grows faster than I can keep up with it. I do not know how I will ever pay it off completely, and Leo's surgery, the doctors say it cannot wait much longer. His heart is getting weaker." Julian felt something shift firmly inside him, a decision solidifying with a clarity he rarely experienced even in his most important business dealings. "Marta, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are not going to deal with this alone anymore. Mr. Cross, I cannot ask you for—" "You are not asking," he interrupted gently. "I am offering. There is a difference." He leaned forward, his voice steady and sure. "I am going to cover the cost of Leo's surgery and his ongoing treatment. I am also going to arrange for that loan to be paid off in full, so that man never comes near you or your son again." Marta stared at him, disbelief written plainly across her face. "Why would you do this? I am only your housekeeper." "You are a mother fighting for her son's life," Julian said simply. "That is reason enough for me, and frankly, Marta, I am ashamed it took me this long to notice how much you were struggling. I walked past you countless times over the past few years, and I never once thought to ask if you were truly all right. That changes today." Marta began crying again, though this time it seemed less like despair and more like overwhelming relief, the kind of release that comes after carrying something unbearably heavy for far too long. "I do not know how to thank you," she whispered. "I do not know how I will ever repay this kindness." "You do not need to repay anything," Julian said. "Just take care of your son. Let him grow up healthy and strong. That will be more than enough." Over the following hours, Julian contacted his personal physician to arrange an urgent consultation with one of the city's leading pediatric heart specialists, Dr. Ellis, ensuring that Leo would receive immediate and comprehensive care, regardless of cost. He also instructed Grace to quietly settle the private loan in full, making certain the aggressive lender would have no further reason to contact Marta again. As the arrangements fell into place throughout the day, Julian found himself reflecting on how close he had come to missing all of this entirely. Had he not glanced out the kitchen window during that particular rainstorm, had he simply accepted her vague excuse and returned to his meetings without a second thought, Marta might have continued suffering in silence indefinitely, her son's condition worsening, while she exhausted herself trying to manage an impossible situation completely alone. That evening, as Marta prepared to leave for the day, she paused at the doorway of Julian's study, hesitating before speaking. "Mr. Cross," she said softly, "may I ask you something?" "Of course," he replied, looking up from his desk. "Why did you notice me that day in the rain?" Other employers might have looked away, might have assumed I simply preferred eating outside, and continued with their day without a second thought. Julian considered the question carefully before answering. I think, he said slowly, some part of me has been searching for a reason to truly see the people around me, rather than simply moving through my days surrounded by them without ever really knowing them. You gave me that reason, Marta, without even realizing it. She smiled faintly, the first genuine smile Julian had seen from her in weeks, and thanked him again before finally heading home to her son, carrying with her, for the first time in a very long while, the lightness of hope rather than the heaviness of fear. Julian remained in his study long after she had gone, staring at the photograph of Leo Reyes that Grace had left in the folder days earlier. He thought about how a single rainy afternoon, one small moment of noticing something out of place, had led to uncovering an entire hidden world of struggle and sacrifice, happening quietly beneath his own roof. And he thought, with a growing sense of purpose he had not felt in years, about how many other people might be suffering in silence all around him, simply waiting for someone to finally stop and truly look. The following weeks moved quickly, filled with hospital visits, medical consultations, and a steady stream of paperwork that Julian handled personally, rather than leaving entirely to his assistants, wanting to be certain nothing about Leo's care was delayed or overlooked. Dr. Ellis, a calm and thorough specialist with a reputation for handling difficult pediatric cases, examined Leo thoroughly and confirmed what Marta had feared for months. The boy's heart condition had progressed to a point where surgery could not be postponed much longer without serious risk. Julian sat beside Marta in the hospital waiting room the day the surgery date was scheduled, a place he had never expected to find himself, surrounded by worried families and the quiet beeping of distant machines. Marta gripped her hands tightly in her lap, and without thinking twice, Julian reached over and placed his hand gently over hers. He is going to be all right, Julian said, though he knew he could not promise such a thing with any real certainty. Dr. Ellis is the best in the city. Leo is in good hands. Marta nodded, though tears gathered in her eyes regardless. I have prayed for this moment for so long, Mr. Cross, and now that it is finally here, I am more frightened than ever. That is normal, Julian said softly. It means you love him. Fear like that only comes from love that deep. She looked at him with something like surprise, as though she had not expected such tenderness from a man she had known for years primarily as her employer, someone who signed her paycheck, and occasionally passed her in hallways with polite but distant greetings. The Julian Cross sitting beside her now in the hospital waiting room felt like an entirely different person, someone who had somehow found his way past the walls of wealth and status to something far more human underneath. In the days leading up to the surgery, Julian found himself thinking constantly about his own life, drawing uncomfortable comparisons between the quiet desperation Marta had hidden so carefully and his own detachment from the people closest to him. He thought about his late father, a man who had built the family business from nothing, but had grown increasingly distant from his own family as success accumulated around him. Julian had sworn, as a young man, that he would never become that kind of person, cold and consumed entirely by ambition. Yet somewhere along the way, without quite realizing it, he had drifted precisely toward that same isolation, surrounded by employees and associates, but genuinely connected to almost no one. Marta's situation had cracked something open in him, a realization that wealth without genuine human connection was, in many ways, its own kind of poverty. He began, almost without meaning to, paying closer attention to the people around him, not just Marta, but Daniel, Grace, and the rest of his household staff, people whose lives he had walked past for years without truly considering the struggles they might be carrying. The morning of Leo's surgery arrived cold and clear, sunlight breaking through clouds that had lingered over the city for days. Julian arranged for Marta to have the entire day off, insisting she focus completely on her son, without any worry about work or income. He also arranged, quietly and without fanfare, to be present at the hospital himself, wanting Marta to know she was not facing this alone. The surgery lasted nearly 6 hours, each minute stretching painfully, as Marta paced the waiting room, unable to sit still despite Julian's gentle attempts to keep her calm. He brought her tea she barely touched, spoke softly whenever her breathing grew shallow with panic, and simply remained present, a steady, quiet support through the most terrifying hours of her life. When Dr. Ellis finally emerged, still in surgical attire, exhaustion evident on his face, but relief clear in his expression. Marta rose so quickly she nearly stumbled. "The surgery went very well," Dr. Ellis said, offering a tired but genuine smile. "Leo's heart responded exactly as we hoped. He will need time to recover, but I am confident he is going to be just fine." Marta collapsed into the nearest chair, sobbing openly, months of fear finally releasing in waves of overwhelming relief. Julian knelt beside her, offering quiet reassurance, feeling an emotion he had rarely experienced so intensely in his own life, a profound gratitude for something entirely outside himself, something that had nothing to do with business success or financial gain. Over the following days, as Leo began his recovery in the hospital, Julian visited several times, bringing small gifts, simple books and toys appropriate for a boy his age, careful not to overwhelm the family with excessive generosity, but wanting Leo to know someone beyond his mother was rooting for his recovery. Leo, still weak but recovering steadily, greeted Julian with the same shy smile Julian had seen in the hospital photograph weeks earlier, though now filled with genuine warmth rather than fear. "Mama says you helped save my life," Leo said quietly during one visit, his voice still hoarse from the surgery. Julian felt an unexpected lump form in his throat. "Your mother is the one who saved your life, Leo. She fought harder for you than anyone I have ever known. I simply helped her fight a little easier." Marta, standing nearby, wiped tears from her eyes, watching the exchange with an expression of gratitude so profound, it seemed to transform her entire face, lifting years of quiet worry that had settled there. As Leo continued recovering steadily over the following weeks, Julian began making other changes as well, changes that extended far beyond Marta's individual situation. He called a meeting with Grace and his senior management team, proposing the creation of an employee support fund, something that had never existed within his company or household staff structure before. "I want to establish a fund," he explained during the meeting, specifically designed to help employees facing medical emergencies, family crises, or financial hardships that go beyond what their regular income can manage. "No one working for me should ever feel forced to hide a struggle, out of fear that asking for help will cost them their job." Grace nodded approvingly, jotting down notes as Julian outlined the details: a confidential application process, dedicated funding separate from regular payroll, and clear guidelines ensuring privacy and dignity for anyone who came forward seeking assistance. It was, Julian realized as he spoke, the first truly meaningful initiative he had created in years that had nothing to do with expanding his business or increasing profits, and strangely, it felt more satisfying than any successful deal he had closed in recent memory. News of the fund spread quietly through his company and household staff over the following weeks, and Julian began noticing subtle shifts in the atmosphere around him. Employees who had once kept careful, guarded distance from him now greeted him with slightly warmer smiles, occasionally sharing small updates about their families or lives that they might never have volunteered before. He realized that trust, once broken by years of quiet distance, could be rebuilt, slowly and carefully, through consistent acts of genuine care rather than empty gestures. Marta, meanwhile, continued working at the Cross household, though something had visibly shifted in her demeanor as well. The constant tension that had once tightened her shoulders and shadowed her eyes gradually eased, replaced by a quiet confidence that had clearly been buried beneath months of fear and exhaustion. She began eating her lunch at the kitchen table again, sometimes even sharing brief conversations with Julian about Leo's recovery, about small, ordinary joys that had returned to her daily life, now that the weight of secrecy had finally lifted. One afternoon, several weeks after the surgery, Julian found Marta in the garden, watching Leo play cautiously near the flower beds, still healing but growing stronger each day. She turned as Julian approached, offering a genuine smile, rather than the polite, guarded expression she had worn for so long. "He looks happy," Julian said, watching Leo chase a butterfly near the hedges. "He is happy," Marta replied softly. "For the first time in a very long while, we both are." She paused, looking at Julian directly. "I still cannot fully understand why you chose to help us the way you did. You owed us nothing." Julian considered her words carefully before answering. "Perhaps I did not do it entirely for you, Marta. Perhaps I needed this as much as you did, a reminder of what truly matters. Something I had lost sight of somewhere along the way, while chasing success that ultimately meant very little, without genuine connection to the people around me. Marta nodded slowly, understanding passing quietly between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that both of their lives had been fundamentally changed by a single rainy afternoon neither of them could have predicted. As Leo's laughter echoed softly through the garden, Julian felt something settle within himself, a sense of purpose and warmth that no business deal or financial achievement had ever quite managed to provide, and he understood, with growing certainty, that this was only the beginning of the changes still to come. 6 months passed, and the Cross household had transformed in ways few who had known Julian previously could have imagined. Leo Reyes, now fully recovered from his surgery, ran through the garden with the boundless energy of any healthy 9-year-old, his laughter becoming a familiar sound throughout the property, one that Julian found himself listening for whenever he arrived home in the evenings. Marta had grown into a different woman entirely, not because her circumstances had made her weak before, but because the crushing weight of secrecy and fear no longer pressed down on every moment of her day. She smiled more easily now, spoke more freely, and moved through her work with a lightness that had been completely absent during those difficult months. Julian, too, had changed in ways that extended far beyond his relationship with Marta and her son. The employee support fund he had established continued growing, expanding to cover not only medical emergencies, but also educational assistance for employees' children, and temporary housing support for families facing sudden hardship. Word of the fund had spread beyond his own company, drawing attention from other business owners curious about implementing similar programs, and Julian found himself, somewhat unexpectedly, becoming an advocate for a kind of corporate responsibility he had never previously considered important. He began speaking occasionally at small business gatherings, not about profit margins or market strategies, subjects he had spent years mastering, but about the quiet cost of overlooking the people who worked closest to you, the assistants, the drivers, the housekeepers, the people whose daily struggles so often remained invisible, simply because no one thought to ask. He spoke about Marta, without revealing unnecessary details of her private life, using her story as an example of how much strength could exist behind a calm, quiet exterior, and how easily that strength could go unnoticed by those too consumed by their own concerns to truly look. One evening, as autumn settled over the city and the trees outside the Cross mansion began shifting into warm shades of gold and amber, Julian sat on the back porch, watching Leo attempt to teach Marta how to properly throw a small rubber ball, both of them laughing as her aim consistently missed its intended target. Julian smiled, something he realized he had been doing far more often lately, a small but meaningful shift from the guarded, distant expression that had once defined his daily demeanor. Marta noticed him watching and walked over, taking a seat in the chair beside his, while Leo continued playing nearby, chasing after the ball he had thrown too far into the garden. "You seem different lately," she observed. "Lighter, somehow." "I feel different," Julian admitted. "I think I spent so many years believing that success meant accumulating more money, more properties, more deals closed, that I forgot what it actually felt like to genuinely care about someone beyond a business relationship. You and Leo reminded me of that, without either of you ever intending to." Marta smiled softly, watching her son continue playing in the fading evening light. "I think we both needed reminding of certain things," she said. "I forgot, for a long time, that it was all right to ask for help, that needing support did not make me weak, or a failure as a mother. I was so afraid of being seen as struggling, that I nearly let my pride cost me the most important thing in my life." "You were never weak," Julian said firmly. "You were carrying something no one should have to carry alone. There is a difference between pride and simply protecting the people you love the only way you know how." They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching Leo's small figure moving through the garden, chasing the ball with renewed energy, despite the medical struggles he had faced only months earlier. It was a scene so ordinary, so simple, that it would have meant almost nothing to Julian a year earlier, easily overlooked amid the busy demands of his daily schedule. Now, it felt like one of the most valuable things in his life, a quiet reminder of everything that truly mattered, beyond wealth and success. As the sky deepened into shades of orange and purple, Julian found himself reflecting on the strange, unexpected journey that had begun with a single glance out a kitchen window during a rainstorm. He thought about how easily he could have missed that moment entirely, how many other mornings he had walked past Marta without truly seeing her, and how close her family had come to facing an impossible situation completely alone, hidden beneath the surface of ordinary daily routines. He thought, too, about how many other people likely existed in similar situations all around him, quietly struggling behind calm, composed exteriors, waiting, whether they realized it or not, for someone to finally stop long enough to notice. The experience had taught him something he suspected he would carry with him for the rest of his life, that true wealth was not measured solely in properties owned or deals closed, but in the willingness to see the people around you clearly, to recognize their struggles, and to offer genuine support without expecting anything in return. Later that evening, after Marta and Leo had gone home, Julian remained on the porch alone, staring out at the darkening garden, where laughter had echoed only hours earlier. He thought about the small, easily overlooked moment that had changed everything. A woman eating quietly in the rain, rather than risk being seen struggling, and the discovery that had followed, one that had reshaped not only her life and her son's future, but his own understanding of what truly mattered. Julian Cross had built an empire through sharp instincts and careful attention to detail, qualities that had served him well throughout his business career. But it was a quiet, rainy afternoon, and a woman he had walked past countless times without truly seeing, that finally taught him the most important lesson of his life, that sometimes the most significant discoveries were not found in boardrooms or financial reports, but in the small, quiet moments most people were too busy or too distracted to ever notice at all. As the stars began appearing faintly above the garden, Julian allowed himself, for perhaps the first time in years, to simply sit still and feel genuinely grateful, not for anything he had built or achieved, but for the unexpected gift of finally learning how to truly see the people around him, a lesson that had arrived, quite unexpectedly, on an ordinary rainy afternoon that had changed everything, forever.